Hello everyone, my name is Stephanie Eldred and I'm with the Center for Best Practices. Thank you for joining us today for the State Legislative Sessions Wrap-Up webinar. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to go over. Attendees are in listen-only mode. We will be recording this webinar today and we will circulate the slides in the webinar recording at a later date. We will also be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please use the question box for your questions and we will read them out loud or respond to them individually. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague Bernadette Dorita to start the webinar.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you are staying cool and enjoying your week so far. So we're really excited to be here today to talk to you about this past legislative session that closed out for the most part this past the beginning of the summer. We know that some of you may have some special sessions around the corner, but we thought now is a good time to take a look back at our sessions this past year and see what has come out of them. Sorry about that.
Go ahead and try again.
Sorry about that. We're just having a little technical difficulties.
Go ahead and try one more time.
Nope. Give us 1 second. All right, I think we should be all set. So like I said, thank you again. Sorry for any delay, but we are excited. We have a great day and great presentations for you today from our guests. So again, I am Advocacy Manager here at Share Our Strength. I've worked a lot with our programs, our partners on the ground on our state advocacy efforts, and excited to talk to you about some of the things that we've been working on and introduce you to some of our great programs who've been doing things in their states. We're going to have Susie Lee, who is from the Greater Chicago Food Depository, join us. She's going to talk about a law that passed in Illinois this year. She also works on the No Kid Hungry Illinois campaign and has a unique perspective working both with the schools and programs on the ground as well as working on our advocacy work in the state. And Lauren McGowan, Director at United Way of King County, Washington, is going to talk a little bit about their campaign to pass breakfast after the bell legislation in Washington State and kind of some of the challenges that they've had over the last few years in that attempt. So our goals today, we're really just going to try to recap some of the activities of the legislative session. We're going to focus on those that will have an impact directly on childhood hunger, some of the child nutrition programs. I know that there are a ton of other things that are out there that are going to have implications for the people that we serve every day. I think we really wanted to just focus because we only have an hour. But I know that there's things like SNAP and WIC and other pieces of legislation that are going to have a direct impact on populations that need these programs. And so I'm happy to hear your suggestions at the end about other topics we'd like to cover on this kind of session. We're also going to try to learn some lessons. So Susie and Lauren will be able to kind of give some of their experience pursuing legislation and what they have learned from the challenges that came up and the outcomes of those. We're also going to celebrate some successes. I think we're going to talk about things that have gone great this year and really discuss what made an impact on accomplishing those goals, really what was the game changer for some of those pieces of legislation. So really quickly, just in review, this is just a snapshot. We have a really big entire spreadsheet, if you will, if you can imagine, of pieces of legislation that were introduced over the past few months, starting from, in many cases, in January, that would have an impact on child nutrition programs. And so this is just some of the highlights, if you will, of some of the more eye-popping kind of pieces of legislation. And I think they set an important lesson that we'll discuss closer to the end of the presentation. So in Colorado, there has been a breakfast after the bell bill, a bill that called, previously the bill would enable schools to offer breakfast after the bell in high-need populations. And so they took another look at that bill this year, and the language that was introduced this year would amend that bill and would reintroduce the opportunity to charge certain students within a certain percentage threshold that under the current law requires that 80% and higher have free or reduced price meals at no cost. So just reopening that law, taking another look at that. That did not pass this year, but it's an interesting look back at a law that's still pretty new. In Delaware, successfully, a bill was passed this year that will impact the 2017 school year. This bill also talks about breakfast after the bell, and what it will offer is it requires schools participating in the community eligibility provision, including charter schools, to provide school breakfast using alternative service models. So similar to some other breakfast after the bell laws that we've seen in the past, giving schools the option to choose the model that works best for them, but also having a kind of a carve out and really saying this is targeting CEP schools through this law. So they successfully were able to pass that bill, and they're just waiting on the governor's signature. In Maryland, an interesting opportunity kind of came out of the session this year. HB 1402, it's called the Public School Opportunities Enhancement Act. This bill is passed and signed, and really in a more interesting way will have an impact on the after-school meals program, because what it does is it establishes grants and really is helping in targeted areas to promote the after-school enrichment programs and after-school programs that our schools are trying and nonprofits are trying to establish for their students. And what it's doing is it's going to give a little bit more opportunity for these programs to get off the ground, and thereby the campaign in in Maryland is going to be working to make sure that school meals and after-school meals are a part of those after-school programs. Another interesting look at a previously passed bill was the New Mexico bill, SB 144. That's the rename, technically the rename Breakfast After the Bell program. And this is a bill that had kind of a roller coaster ride throughout the session. It re-looked at the previous Breakfast After the Bell legislation that passed a couple years ago, and that bill says that schools are required to do breakfast after the bell at a certain high need threshold. In this bill, it just provided some additional clarity that you can offer breakfast before the instructional day as long as breakfast is also served after the start of the school day in high need communities. And I think that took a lot of different forms throughout the process, and there is a lot of interesting lessons to be learned from that we'll talk about at the end too. So now I'm going to just turn it over, and after that high-level view of a couple things that came our way. And I will say that when we get to the Q&A section in a little bit, I'm really hoping that you will be able to share some of your observations or some legislation that's passed in your communities or in your state, so we can have even more on our radar screen. There's obviously we can't be in every state. There's only so many of us, so having lots of eyes on these things is really important, and we wanted to talk about that. So first up, we're going to have Lauren talk to us about HB 1295 and the initiatives that they had in Washington this past legislative session. Go ahead, Lauren.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you all for taking the time to participate today and for having me. I work over at United Way of King County, and we have been working on school breakfast legislation for several years now, and I think have started off really from a place of needing to learn, educate our community, mobilize partners, and now really just locked into a political battle to get this done. So excited to share what we've learned over the last couple of years. So we launched our Breakfast After the Bell initiative about 4 years ago, starting off with working with a small coalition of partners and our local Appleseed to develop a report on the state of school breakfast in Washington. And that really gave us the data and findings to say, okay, this is an issue in our community, and begin to develop political champions. We found that our legislators really got excited about it right off the bat, and we had a couple of legislators run and sort of announce a bill before we even had time to build a coalition. I think 4 years later, they now thought that it was going to be a lot easier to get this passed than it actually was. But some of those same legislators are still with us today and still believe that Breakfast After the Bell is absolutely the right thing to do. So from the beginning, our approach has been that schools where at least 70% of students are eligible for free or reduced price meals would be required to offer breakfast after the bell. Each year, as we've shaped the bill, we've had financial resources attached to that, including about $6,000 to schools that are fairly flexible resources for them to implement the legislation. And that's something that we negotiated pretty carefully with our School Nutrition Association to get to that number and to feel good about it. Our legislation gives schools the flexibility to choose a model that works for them. So that could be a breakfast in the classroom model, grab and go, or second chance. Really trying to give local communities the choice to do what's going to work best for them. Again, the bill was introduced in each of the last 3 legislative sessions, and it continuously gets passed through the House. So we have really strong champions in the House. Every year we get better at bringing more and more of a diverse coalition along. The House in Washington is heavily controlled by Democrats, and so they've been very supportive. We've continuously seen opposition in our state Senate, and that is a Republican-controlled Senate. We do have a champion in the Senate, so the Senate sponsor is a Republican, is somebody who has championed the bill, and heads up the Education Committee in the Senate, but has not been able to get this bill passed down to the floor. And then we have support from the governor. In some years it's been included in his budget and some not, and that's really been really a political strategy as we've tried to bring some of those more conservative members in the Senate along with this approach. So on our next slide, some of the challenges and outcomes, again, we've been running this for a number of years, and so we've spent a lot of time bringing partners along. When we first launched this, there was about 4 agencies, including United Way, who said, yeah, let's do this. And now we've got a really broad and diverse coalition. But it took time. It took a lot of time to bring people along. One of the biggest sources of opposition for us has been our Office of the Superintendent for Public Instruction, and that's our version of the Department of Education. They have been, and that's also where all of our child nutrition programs are situated in the state. They have opposed this bill in several sessions. This year they were sort of neutral on it. But they really haven't been champions for the mandate in particular. So that's been a challenge. We also have a lot of complex things happening in our state related to education, and that is partially why that's been challenging. One of the things that came up around this time last year, so after we ran the bill for the second time, was some concern from the State Board of Education about breakfast counting as instructional time. So like many of you, we have many school districts that are really innovative and have gone out and are doing breakfast after the bell programs. But they were starting to get guidance from our State Board of Education that they could not use or count those hours toward instructional time, even if they were doing read alouds or blackboard problems or anything like that. Instruction was going on. They were saying, nope, can't count. We were able to demonstrate that many other states have been able to overcome this challenge and able to sort of neutralize them on the topic. But we did add language about this to our bill in the last session. We initially had a lot of concerns from our School Nutrition Association. When we first launched this, they were not excited at all, not excited about the mandate, didn't feel like they could bring their schools along, and felt like it was going to be a lot of extra work. And so we worked with them to design and shape a bill that was going to work for them, as well as ultimately for the kids on the ground. And eventually they became some of our strongest advocates. So today we've got a really strong relationship with them. We're working closely with them to do pilot programs of breakfast after the bell around the state. And I think we all agree now that a mandate is ultimately what is needed. An interesting concern that came up last year, particularly from a legislator who is a dentist, was some concern about the nutritional value of meals, particularly the sugar content. And she really raised some concern about this to a point where we actually had to write into one of the versions of the bill that we would, School Nutrition Association would reduce the sugar content in the bill, and this caused a lot of challenges with our Nutrition Association. They were not excited about that. Obviously, they already have a lot to deal with because of federal guidelines. So this was trying to appease a legislator, and it made some other folks not very happy. I'm happy to share that language if anybody's interested. You know, finally for us, the biggest concern we have is a small block of legislators who are in leadership positions who have a personal philosophy that we shouldn't be giving handouts to kids, that this just makes it easier. You know, you get a lot of stereotypes about parents who can't get their kids to school on time. And we worked really closely with Share Our Strength to bring in some very seasoned and more conservative lobbyists with great relations. We had other legislators calling, former legislators, and there's just a small group of folks who just can't get over that, and because of where they sit in leadership, they essentially block the bill from getting to the floor. And then finally, I think this is a big learning for us. You know, we really came out strong early on that this was a mandate, and no one likes the word mandate, and no one likes to be told what to do. So we spent some time, doing pilot programs across the state. So we had, we provided grants to schools all across Washington, and we were able to demonstrate how hard it was to get schools on board. Not because they didn't want to do it, but because it's complex to get unions and nutrition staff and principals and superintendents, and really try to use that to make a case that that mandate was important. We also changed our language, so in any of our talking points or testimony, we'll never use the word mandate. We switched that from mandate to a guarantee. It gives kids food where and when it matters. And then some of the lessons learned this year, you know, our biggest thing is to learn what others have done. I know there's other folks on this call who have seen successful legislation or gone down this path. From the beginning, we modeled our work after Colorado, after other folks that have been doing this. And I think that really helped us to be able to say both, this is what's happening, and not recreate the wheel. For us, having some of those pilots was really important because despite having great evidence from other states and national reports from Share Our Strength, folks wanted to know that it could actually work in our local community. So we did demonstration projects in small communities and big communities, urban, rural, just to show that, breakfast after the bell absolutely can work almost anywhere, and that it's financially a good thing for most folks to do. As I said, building that coalition was really important. We were so excited to launch this a couple years ago with a small group of folks, and it just seems so simple. Of course we want all kids to have school breakfast. And then we faced opposition from people who should have been our allies. So we spent the last few years really building a big, diverse coalition that includes custodial unions, PTA, school leaders, really everyone, so that when we went in and testified this year, you would have dozens and dozens and dozens of folks signing in, and there was no one signing in opposition this year, which was really, really great, because even though we ultimately didn't pass legislation, the overwhelming support showed that this is what folks want, and it's really helped us as we've gone back to local communities to try to flip their models even without that legislation. I will say that in any time that you have a coalition, it's really important to be clear on who the decision makers in that coalition are, particularly when you're working on tight timelines with a lot of folks. It's often, a legislator and a lobbyist and me working late at night and saying, okay, what are we going to do? And there's not a lot of time to get buy-in from 30, 40, 50 people. So being really clear on who those decision makers are is important. Another great learning we had was just taking the time to educate folks. So we did a lot of webinars just like this, calls, info sessions, where folks could ask questions and feel not just if they were getting like top-level messaging, but that they could really understand. People want to know, like, what does it actually take to serve breakfast after the bell? If you've never seen that, if you've never done it, we found a lot of people just needed to understand and see pictures and become more familiar. And then one of the things that I certainly recommend is having a strong communications plan from the get-go, so you're ready to go with op-eds, social media, all of that. Having both a combination of data for those folks who want to understand, how many more kids are going to eat, and how much money is going to come to our community, as well as just those softer stories of principals or school nurses talking about how successful it is. And Share Our Strength was really, really helpful in that. And then finally is be willing to compromise up to a point. We spent a lot of time at the end of this legislative session. We were in special session number 2, and we're just trying to get this passed, and we spent some time trying to sort of compromise with our Senate colleagues to say, okay, what are we willing to give up? Are we willing to do a smaller pilot, or can we do it without the money? Can it be a public-private match? Can we reduce the number of schools? Does it have to be a mandate? All of those things. And I think just being really clear with your coalition partners where that ends, like what's your breaking point, but being willing to be creative about ideas, think about what it could look like. If you have a legislator who is really upset about sugar, what do you do about that? How can you make it work and bring those legislators along without compromising the bill? So finally for us, it has been 3 legislative sessions, and we're still going. We haven't passed this yet. We have seen more and more districts be willing to do it without that mandate, but we know that that is time-consuming and slow, and it doesn't get, and ultimately it's not equitable, and that's what we care about most. So we will continue to work for legislation. We are currently waiting for the election season to see where people end up in leadership positions, and that will help us determine what our strategy is for next session.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I can attest to Lauren's diligence on this issue. She's been working really hard to make this happen. And I can also, just for context for the audience, you know, the Washington campaign had the dual challenge of having to convince folks of a difficult issue, but also doing it within a 60-day legislative calendar this year. The calendar, with like many of you do, they have a short session and a long session, and this was a short session here. So it was a tremendous undertaking, and we got so far. I know Lauren really put it all out there, so thank you for your hard work. And also, you know, if you all are trying to figure out how to do these things with short sessions in your future, Lauren is a great resource of how you can get it done. All right, so now I'll kick it over to, thank you. So now I will ask Susie Lee to jump in and introduce SB 2393 from the state of Illinois.
Hello, I just wanted to start by saying I'm thrilled to be sharing this work with everyone, and I really hope that you find this information useful. So the background of SB 2393, the bill itself is pretty similar to the structure that Washington had. So the similarities are that it required schools with 70% or higher free and reduced price eligibility to serve breakfast after the bell, and also the schools had the choice of what model worked best for them as long as it was after the bell. The biggest difference is Illinois has a very special budget situation in which we have no money. Some of you might be aware we've had a budget impasse for more or less a year and a half. We knew from the very beginning that there was absolutely no opportunity to ask for startup funds or any contribution from the state. So we knew from the beginning we would have to come up with a strategy that supported breakfast and also was financially sustainable on its own. But before I get ahead of myself, I want to talk about sort of the process that led up to it. I think one of the things that was incredibly important to the ultimate success of this bill was that we took it pretty slow. We wanted to make sure that we had all the proper foundational work done before we started trying to push legislation. So back in May of 2015, we had a breakfast resolution on the Senate and the House side that passed, and it was very generally in support of the expansion for breakfast. So in our 2015 lobby day, we had about 200 plus advocates from across the state going, talking to their state elected officials, and really talking about breakfast, encouraging them to make site visits and a lot of the support for the program, just kind of the background information. And that set the foundation for our work. So in the summer of 2015, we started calculating the potential impact, and I've got to say, I will never forget the day. Somebody asked me, they said, well, you know, we here in Illinois already had a mandate that if you had 40% of students free and reduced price eligible, that you had to serve breakfast in some form. It didn't have any stipulations about the time of day. So they said, how many kids do you really think you're going to impact? And the first time I calculated it, it came out to 106,000 additional kids getting breakfast every single day. And that blew my mind. And then when I worked with the Social Impact Center, they said, actually, Susie, you calculated wrong. It's over 175,000 kids that would have access to breakfast every day that don't right now. So we knew for sure we were going to take this path and we were going to go for breakfast legislation. So once we knew how many kids it was going to impact, the next thing was to work with the Social Impact Center and start developing this plan for financial sustainability. So we took a look at using the School Nutrition Association's National Operations Report. We were able to get the average cost of a meal from data that actually came from food service providers, and then compare that to the reimbursement rate and using a threshold of 70% or higher free or reduced price eligibility. So we were able to go through district by district, school by school, and lay out not only that they would have a positive impact, but exactly how much we estimated their increase would be. So that tool of having a financial sustainability report before we ever started the process of talking to folks about a bill was incredibly helpful in those conversations. And once we were armed with those numbers, a next really huge piece for us, from the fall of 2015 through the spring of 2016, we had a lot of behind-the-scenes conversations, reaching out to partners, folks that were members of our collaborating table, associations that we had not yet had partnerships with. We reached out to a lot of large educational associations. There are a number of Cook County suburban groups that are quite influential across the state, as well as downstate groups. And so we started having these conversations, letting them know what our ideas were, getting feedback from them. And once we felt like we had a pretty solid idea, we got together with Share Our Strengths team, and we decided that we were ready to engage with some lobbyists. And fortunately, we knew former State Senator John Milner, who was a Republican when he was in office, and he had also previously championed children's issues in the past. So he met with the team and was just a really fantastic fit, along with his partner, Scott Marquardt. And they joined our coalition and were really our boots on the ground. So in March, the Financial Sustainability Report was publicly released so that our lobbyists could take it to any of the conversations that they were with, and also districts and local organizations could have access to it as well. And we were building and building our coalition up until our May 2016 lobby day, where we had over 250 advocates. And this time, instead of talking about a breakfast resolution, they were talking about the bill. So I'll go ahead and move on to challenges and outcomes. As I mentioned, the biggest challenge for sure was the lack of a state budget and statewide financial instability. We needed to make sure that our number one point in any conversation, well, let's say number two. Number one is do it for the kids. These kids need access for all of the reasons that we all know in terms of school development and reaching their full potential. But second to that the program pays for itself. It's financially sustainable. So those points were equally important. We just had to make sure every single conversation included that financial information. Otherwise, we knew our bill was going to get stuck. Again, also, we had some nervousness in our own organization and some of our partners about trying to launch legislation in this session when there was a lot of political gridlock at the highest levels. So we were afraid it was going to get sort of lost in the shuffle of everything that was going on in Springfield this year. And another piece was we had some initial pushback from the Illinois Principals Association. So they had some concerns, again, particularly about the idea of a mandate. So we had some really productive conversations about why a mandate is so important and why putting forth a bill that's just an option or a suggestion really wasn't a change from what we were doing right now. Also similar to Washington, we talked about, we've been giving breakfast grants for the last 3 years. We granted to 73 districts across the state, but a lot of them were really small districts. And so we had only moved the needle a couple of percentage points after more than $270,000 of investment in grants. So our conversation with the Principals Association progressed, and we finally found a solution for some waiver language that provided a process that everyone was comfortable with, where schools that had really serious financial difficulties could find a waiver out of the process. So that was a solution that we all came to, and again, we were really fortunate to have the Principals Association become great champions, and they had actually gotten an elected official to originally kill the bill who ended up advocating for it in committee hearings and being an incredible advocate and really winning over a lot of people, particularly on the Republican side. And in the end, we had a unanimous passage of the bill in both the Senate and the House. So I'll move on to lessons learned. And on this slide, we have a lovely photo of all of those 250 plus advocates on the Capitol steps. That was before we were exhausted after walking the halls all day. So everybody had a lot of energy when we took that photo. But again, just to sort of summarize, preparation for us was really essential. I completely believe that all of the pounding the pavement and calls and coalition building before we actually shared legislative language with anyone really helped us move forward. So having those initial resolutions, again, we studied other states. We looked a lot, particularly at Colorado and New Mexico. And I think something that's sort of a soft skill, I'll say, or a soft positive, was really having confidence in the team, both in terms of our partnership with the staff here at GCFD, with the team at Sheriff Strength, and the lobbying team themselves. We had great communication. We talked on a weekly basis, kept everything moving, and addressed any concerns when they came up. And it really built a strong trust and a really strong team, and I think that helped us get across the finish line as well. And outside of those sort of partnerships, the larger coalition, we ended up having over 20 organizations sign on in support of our legislative agenda this year. And again, that financial sustainability report really drew the picture so that we addressed most of the concerns before anyone had a chance to raise them. We had already had an answer. So I'm happy to answer any specific questions, but I will hand it back to Bernadette. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. We have a question that we're going to hold on to for a second, but I just want to reiterate some of the things that Susie just kind of concluded with. You know, I think a key component of this was being really prepared with great data, and that's a lesson that we learned early on, was having that to walk into with the conversations. I think really also the knowledge that you can't necessarily assume that something is going to be successful or fail based on what you know of the political landscape. I think if you had, when we were walking in, we thought, I don't know, this budget situation is pretty bad, and we really didn't think that we had a very good shot at being successful, but we were going to take our chances. And I think with the right argument, with the right messaging, and with the right data and information at our fingertips, we were able to see that we could work through a lot of those concerns and get something that was successful. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about some of the messaging campaign that went into the bill, check out illinoisbreakfast.org, and you'll see some of the things that we were able to put out there in terms of a public messaging around what this bill is. You'll also see some of the coalition support and some of the stakeholder support that we were able to demonstrate for the bill. So again, thank you to Lauren and to Susie for their take on kind of their each unique initiatives. You know, Illinois and Washington are very different states, some similar themes throughout. And I think, again, looking back at some of the other pieces of legislation that have come before legislatures this past year, we wanted to just observe a few takeaways from our perspective, and we're really eager to hear yours as well. I think one of the first one is that child nutrition legislation is being introduced in high frequency throughout the country, and you heard about two ways that were very high profile through mandates that try to work their way through the legislature this year. But there's other things as well that are happening. In California, they were able to institute some grant funding to support Breakfast After the Bell initiative through the budget process. There are funding like the after-school meals or after-school program funding that was included in Maryland. So funding continues to be a great gateway into how programs can grow and how additional policy can be implemented down the line. I think program guidance continues to be a part too, where that continual need to clarify and to go back and to look at how laws are written to impact these programs. I think school breakfast and breakfast after the bell legislation, as you just heard, definitely continues to be the most common form, but as I just said, I think there's lots of opportunities out there for summer meals legislation and after-school meals legislation. Things like this have popped up. Our best practices at nogetthungry.org website kind of goes into some of those different policies that have appeared. So breakfast is not the only option that we have when it comes to how to impact child nutrition programs on the state level. There's other types of legislation as well. So I think, again, just to kind of reiterate the funding point, reimbursements. So in a lot of states, they've been able to make headway and educate folks by including additional reimbursements as part of their budget conversations to support breakfast after the bell. In Virginia, that's where you have a great model like that, where they're providing an additional incentive for programs to implement that type of breakfast service and making it a financial gain for states and for schools when they implement those kinds of programs. And again, I think the other key takeaway here is legislation, as always, continues to be scrutinized even years after it's passed and implemented. These are evolving issues, and federal policy has a role to play here, and schools and different stakeholders are constantly going back to their legislators to talk about and clarify what they need and potentially challenge things that have already been passed. Just because a bill has been passed does not mean it can't be amended. So I think for those of you who are in states where there might be positive policy or negative policy, continue to look at or defend the policies and make sure that folks with so many new members coming into office in the fall, that folks are educated on these issues before they make policy decisions. So as you may be thinking, that's great, these states are doing this, we want to get on this bandwagon too. We think that there's some real opportunity in our state, and we've taken a look at the scene on the ground, and we know that legislation is the right way to move forward, or policy is the right way to move forward. Here are a few kind of steps that you should think about, and right now in the middle of the summer is the perfect time to be doing that while sessions are out, while things are a little bit quieter, and before some of the bigger budget discussions are happening in your states in the fall. Now is the time to be asking yourself some of these very important questions. I think objectives is a really critical one. Sometimes, you heard a lot about data today, and one of the things that's really important that we at Share Our Strengths have learned recently is that when you look at the data, sometimes you may have an objective to feed more kids, and you may think that legislation is the path to do that. But not necessarily the type of legislation we've talked about today is the right way to go about that. There might be some other type of policy fix that's needed. So you really have to have a clear look at what your objective is and what your data supports, that, whether or not it supports that objective. Now is the time to also be thinking about your decision makers, who you need to be in touch with. There are elections happening, and so following the IRS guidelines, what kind of education can you do to candidates on both sides to make sure that they know about the type of policies that are out there that impact child nutrition. Also being prepared to work with transition staff once that elections do happen, but really working to identify who's going to be in office, who are the decision makers in the capitals, and who you need to make sure understand the policies clearly. Again, kind of same thing in the landscape. What's going to be different? What might make a policy fail? Is your state working through some budget challenges? Are you, working through labor discussions? Really have a clear understanding of your landscape. And as you frame your messages, as you're thinking through these decision makers, really what is their background? What kind of things are they looking to hear from you? What kind of information do they need? We oftentimes like to approach things as our subject matter expert selves, but sometimes they don't have time for that. Our audiences need to have things boiled down and broken down in a way that they can understand quickly. And again, message. I think you should constantly be evolving your message here on the programs. As you could kind of hear from both Susie and Lauren, they both had to reapproach the message that they were using as part of the legislative initiative to make sure that it was resonating well with the situation on the ground and the status of their state conversation. It's got to be constantly evolving. So these are the types of questions you should be asking yourself now and anticipating and building upon the answers, so that way if you think that a legislative campaign is something that makes sense for your state or your coalition, that you're ready to hit the ground running in the fall. And so you've heard several references to Share Our Strengths, kind of working with both in Washington and in Illinois. And so I think we really want to make sure that it's clear to all of you that we are interested in your legislative campaigns. You know, we don't have a No Kid Hungry campaign in Delaware, but we were happy to help our friends at the food bank there work through the policy decisions that they were making and help make sure they had the best bill possible. So these are some of the things that we can provide here at Share Our Strengths through the No Kid Hungry campaign. We're happy to work with you on drafting some policy or legislation, getting technical assistance for you that you can make sure that it works through the process in your state. We are also, as you've heard, we have our wonderful campaigns doing fantastic advocacy work, having this kind of experience under their belts. We're happy to connect you to them and provide peer-to-peer connections. A lot of times we have found that learning from one another from a similar state or from similar challenges is really critical, making sure that you're positioning yourself for success. And communications assets. We have a phenomenal team here, and you'll see if you go to illinoisbreakfast.org, our team is able to really come up with things that are compelling, that help tell your message and bring your case forward and make a legislative issue make a lot more sense for the common audience. So we're happy to talk to you about that and maybe see if we can work on some customizable templates for you and make sense for your campaign. And again, check out the bottom two links on the bottom of this slide. The one will give you to the policy pages. Under each subject matter, you'll find a policy page specific to that. So you'll see some legislative precedent for each of those policies. And then No Kid Hungry Playbook is a great resource actually for you as a campaign, but also to direct elected officials towards. There's a section specifically for leaders that will talk to them about how they can be involved and kind of make them take ownership of this policy process. So for that, we will open it up for questions, comments. Again, would love to learn if there's things that you'd love to learn more about, or if something has happened in your state, feel free to message those in so that way we are aware of it and we can share that with the group. So I will start, and Stephanie's going to read your questions aloud here, and we'll read them aloud and answer them in turn.
Okay, great. We have a question from Tirza Asbel, and she was asking Susie, what was your outreach approach, and were you in touch by the way of calls, emails, newsletters, or in-person meetings?
That's a great question. So I'm sitting here thinking outreach towards partners or outreach towards the public, so I'll just answer both. Outreach to our partners was mostly email. We do have our collaborating table, our No Kid Hungry collaborating table is kind of our primary place to gather our thoughts and ideas with our partners, and that met on a quarterly basis, so we would always have updates in person at those meetings, and then lots of emails and follow-up calls to make sure folks were on the same page. When we were working with organizations like some of those education associations, school district associations, those were always in-person meetings just so that we could really dig into any questions they had. As far as outreach to really build public support, we did lean pretty heavily on the Share Our Strengths communications team. Like Bernadette mentioned, they had the website, and we also have a submission form on our Rise and Shine Illinois website, our breakfast campaign for the state to raise awareness. So public awareness was much more digital and social media focused.
Great. Thank you, Susie.
Okay, great. We have a question for Lauren. What do you think made a significant difference in your approach to the law this year?
That's a great question. You know, I would say we just spent a lot of time listening this year and sort of going through last summer and really working with those folks who did have any kind of opposition to it to understand what their concerns were. The bill across each of the years was really similar, but the financial amount changed a little bit, and the ramp-up period changed, and that was really based on what folks in the community wanted and could get behind, so we could really present a unified force.
And actually, Lauren, and I think one of the big things, if I can add, this is Bernadette, I can add to that too, was bringing in some unexpected partners. So I think one of the big things was successful that we were able to do was bring in a more conservative lobbyist to the table, and so being able to change the dialogue a little bit, and by giving validation that this was an issue that both parties could see eye to eye on, I think that really helped the conversation this year, change the tone a little bit. If you may want to, do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's, we have a really amazing lobbyist that has been working this for a couple of years, but is definitely seen as like the socially liberal guy. And in working with Share Our Strength and being able to bring in somebody who just had different relationships and was able to sit in meetings that we weren't necessarily invited to, I think it helped us really be able to understand what concerns were there, and where there were concerns that people were not like bringing up to us, right? So people who might be to our face saying, yeah, I support this, but behind closed doors are saying that they don't support it. Well, what does that mean? And sort of, how do we count our champions and really sort of hold them accountable, and how do we make changes? And when we made some compromises on the bill at the end of session, it really was because of some of those learnings. So really appreciate that support, and would highly recommend making sure that you have sort of that diverse coalition and partners and lobbyists to go in.
Okay, great. We just got another question in from Linda. This question is for Susie. How did the passing of the bill impact the school nutrition staff, and were there more food service jobs created to meet the needs of increased breakfast participation?
That is an amazing question, which I will look forward to learning the answer to. We just passed the bill this past May, and it has not yet been signed by the governor. It is set to take effect January 2017. So I'm hoping to see results in that direction, but we haven't gotten there yet.
And Susie, I think one of the other things too is it speaks to the need for having a really good implementation plan. I think we all want these bills to be successful, and I think a key part of that is making sure that we can answer some of these questions and prepare schools and food and nutrition staff for that. So I'm not sure if you want to talk any about your plan for implementation or how you're approaching that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are also very concerned isn't the right word, very interested in having a strong implementation plan. So we have plans to meet with the State Board of Education's nutrition team, their principal consultant on breakfast, and start talking about what concerns have they run into for schools that are starting, what experience have we had with schools that have started a breakfast after the bell program and have utilized our grants, what kind of support we think will be needed, and also being prepared for the types of questions we might get about the waiver and the sort of opt-out provision. So we're definitely planning to work really closely with the State Board of Education, meeting on a regular basis, sharing best practices that we've learned in our work, what Share Our Strength has learned at the national level, and what they have experienced on their own, to make sure that when schools actually go to start a program, that they have a toolkit in their hands that says, here is step 1, 2, and 3, here's the phone number and an email address for our breakfast coordinators that can support you and answer your questions. Also information, we will have grants available again in the coming years. So we really want to make sure that it's a smooth implementation.
Great question. So I think with that we might conclude, since we're just about at time. I will reiterate the webinar, the recording, contact information will be shared with you following the conclusion today. If you have a law or if there is something that's bubbling underneath the surface in your state and you'd love to talk to us about it, we would love to talk to you about it as well. So please feel free to contact us and we can talk through what's happening in your state. Thank you for your time. Thank you to Lauren and Susie. We appreciate your time with us this afternoon. And with that, we'll adjourn. Have a great afternoon.